On the morning of March 3rd, 1943, at precisely 9:58 a.m., Major Paul Gunn found himself seated in the cockpit of a B-25 bomber called Margaret, observing as the horizon of the Bismarck Sea tilted dramatically to his left. His speed registered at 200 miles per hour. Though his altitude was far from typical, he maintained just 50 feet above the ocean's surface, close enough to distinguish individual whitecaps and sense the salt spray coating his windshield. Through the haze ahead, a Japanese destroyer came into view. This 2,000-ton steel predator bristled with anti-aircraft weaponry specifically engineered to eliminate aircraft exactly like his. According to standard procedure, what he was attempting constituted nothing short of suicide. Military doctrine insisted that a medium bomber should operate at 8,000 feet altitude, releasing ordnance from a stable, level trajectory. The field manual made it mathematically clear. Approaching a warship head-on at mast height guaranteed certain death. None of this concerned Paul Gunn in the slightest. His focus remained fixed on the trigger switch positioned beneath his thumb. He wasn't relying on a traditional bomb sight. Instead, his targeting consisted of a simple iron ring mounted directly on the cowling. He held his position, watching patiently. Through the glass, the destroyer's image expanded steadily. Japanese sailors scrambled frantically across the deck, now visible to him. He could make out the barrels of their 25-millimeter autocannons rotating, tracking, locking onto his aircraft's nose. The gap between them narrowed, 1,000 yards, then 800 yards. The engineers stationed back in California had emphatically warned him this system wouldn't function. They'd cautioned that pulling the trigger would cause the recoil from his improvised weapon system to shatter the windscreen, twist the aluminum airframe, and potentially stall both engines completely. They'd dismissed his invention as nothing more than a mechanic's fever dream. They'd laughed openly at the springs he'd salvaged from a junkyard to absorb the violent shock. Gunn's grip tightened on the yoke. He was neither a test pilot nor a trained engineer. He was a 43-year-old father whose wife and 4 children were enduring starvation conditions in a Japanese prison camp in Manila. He squeezed the trigger firmly. The B-25's nose didn't simply fire. It erupted violently. 8.50 caliber machine guns discharged simultaneously. That translates to 120 rounds exiting the aircraft every single second. The recoil force struck the airframe with the impact of a car crash. The bomber shuddered violently, the rivets screamed under stress, and cordite smoke filled the cockpit completely. Yet the windscreen held intact, and the springs absorbed the energy perfectly. Down below, on the water's surface, the Japanese destroyer didn't disappear in some dramatic puff of smoke. Instead, it began disintegrating under what could only be described as a chainsaw made entirely of lead. To understand why a 43-year-old major was piloting a bomber as though it were a fighter plane, you need to examine the scoreboard. During late 1942, the United States Army Air Force was losing battles systematically. They were losing primarily because they were attempting to wage war using mathematical calculations that simply didn't add up correctly. The established doctrine had been constructed around the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Norden bomb site. The general stationed in Washington firmly believed that a B-17 operating at 20,000 feet could drop a bomb accurately into a pickle barrel. That exact phrase became their selling point to the American public. Pickle barrel accuracy, they promised. It sounded impressive in newsreels shown in theaters nationwide. In actual combat operations, it proved to be an absolute disaster. Throughout the Pacific Theater, the targets weren't stationary factories or train stations that remained in fixed positions. The targets consisted of ships, Japanese destroyers and troop transports moving at 30 knots, zigzagging continuously across open ocean. When a B-17 released a bomb from 20,000 feet altitude, that bomb required nearly 40 full seconds to reach the water's surface. During those 40 critical seconds, a Japanese ship captain could execute a turn, light and smoke a cigarette leisurely, and watch the bomb splash harmlessly into the sea half a mile from his vessel. The statistical results were absolutely humiliating. Throughout the first year of the war, high-altitude bombers achieved a hit rate against moving vessels of less than 1%. They were literally burning through millions of gallons of precious aviation fuel merely to kill fish. Meanwhile, the Japanese were efficiently running what they called the Tokyo Express. This operated as a conveyor belt system of fast convoys transporting thousands of troops into New Guinea territory. They were systematically reinforcing their garrisons at Lae and Salamaua, constructing what amounted to a fortress wall north of Australia. If they succeeded in landing sufficient numbers of men, they would control the airstrips. If they controlled those airstrips, they could bomb Australia into submission. The Allied commander, overseeing the Southwest Pacific, General George Kenney, studied the reports carefully and recognized the brutal truth. His heavy bombers were proven completely useless against shipping targets. He didn't need a precision scalpel that operated from 5 miles up. He needed a sledgehammer that functioned effectively at point-blank range. Kenney faced a significant problem, however. He didn't possess a dedicated attack aircraft in his arsenal. What he had available was the B-25 Mitchell. The Mitchell was fundamentally a good aircraft, a medium bomber that was both fast and rugged, but it had been designed for an entirely different kind of war. It featured a glass nose section where a bombardier sat perched on a small stool, peering through a delicately calibrated optical sight. It carried only a few light machine guns strictly for defensive purposes, mostly pointing backward to discourage pursuing fighters. It functioned as a defensive weapon platform engineered to flee after releasing its payload. Kenney required a plane that charged directly toward the fight. He needed what could only be described as a commerce destroyer. Enter Paul Gunn into the equation. The men universally called him Papy because at age 43 he was considered ancient by contemporary aviation standards. The majority of pilots serving in the Pacific were 21-year-old kids who had learned to fly in Iowa cornfields merely 6 months earlier. Gunn had been flying aircraft since the 1920s. His background included service as a naval aviator, followed by work as a civilian airline pilot throughout the Philippines. He possessed intimate knowledge of the jungle environment, understood the islands thoroughly, and comprehended machines instinctively. But Papy Gun wasn't driven by patriotism or abstract duty. He was motivated by a cold, relentless rage that genuinely terrified younger officers around him. When the Japanese military invaded the Philippines in 1941, Gunn had managed to escape in a severely damaged plane. His wife Polly and their 4 children had not been so fortunate. They were captured in Manila and thrown into the Santo Tomas internment camp. Gunn knew exactly what conditions existed in those camps. He was fully aware of the starvation, the rampant disease, and the systematic brutality. Every single day the war continued represented another day his children might die. He didn't have time for established doctrine. He didn't have time for elaborate test flights or committee meetings. He walked directly into General Kenny's office in Brisbane, Australia, and proposed something that sounded completely insane. He wanted to take the B-25, completely strip out the bombardier position, remove the bomb sight entirely, and transform the glass nose into a gun battery. His plan involved packing 4 fixed .50 caliber machine guns into the nose section, plus 2 additional guns in external pods mounted on the sides, plus locking the top turret to fire forward. His goal was transforming a medium bomber into essentially a flying shotgun with greater forward firepower than a tank possessed. General Kenny was desperate enough to authorize it. He provided Gunn with a hangar in Brisbane and instructed him to make it happen. However, when the engineers from North American Aviation, the company that manufactured the B-25, heard about this plan, they didn't simply say no. They laughed out loud. They sent detailed memos explaining the fundamental laws of physics to what they considered a confused major. The nose of a B-25 was essentially a greenhouse structure. It consisted of a lightweight frame of aluminum strips holding plexiglass panels in place. It had been designed to support only the weight of one man and a 15-pound bomb sight. The engineers carefully explained the mathematics of the .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun. This wasn't some rifle. It represented a piece of heavy industrial machinery. Each individual gun weighed 64 pounds. It fired a bullet the size of a human finger at 2,900 feet per second velocity. The recoil energy generated by firing just one gun was immense. Gunn wanted to install 4 of them in the nose section. The calculations were absolutely clear. If you fired 4.5 simultaneously from that mounting point, the recoil force would shear the rivets completely. The nose section would literally snap off the fuselage. Even if the frame somehow held together, the vibration would instantly shatter the glass, effectively blinding the pilot. And even if the glass miraculously held, the combined weight of the guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition would shift the center of gravity so dramatically forward that the plane would become unflyable. It would nosedive directly into the runway the instant the wheels left the ground. They called it the suicide box. They warned Kenny that Gunn was going to kill his pilots before they ever encountered the Japanese. Gunn read through all the memos carefully. Then he threw them directly in the trash. He wasn't constructing a plane to pass any safety inspection. He was building a plane capable of sinking the ships that were supplying the prison guards in Manila. He headed to the scrap piles at the Royal Australian Air Force Base. He didn't search for aviation-grade aluminum. He looked specifically for steel. He located old shock absorbers, heavy springs, and felt pads typically used for industrial machinery. Gunn's theory was elegantly simple. The engineers were assuming a rigid mounting system. If you bolted the guns directly to the airframe, yes, the frame would snap. But Gunn had no intention of bolting them rigidly. He was going to float them on a suspension system. He designed what he called a quote-to-dash, a bizarre contraption constructed of steel tubes and plates that suspended the 4 heavy guns in the center of the nose cavity. The guns would rest on a cradle capable of sliding backward. Behind this cradle, he installed his scavenged springs and shock absorbers. The concept was that when the guns fired, the entire battery would recoil backward into the springs, which would absorb the energy before it could reach the delicate aluminum frame. It was pure garage engineering. It looked absolutely ugly. It added hundreds of pounds of dead weight to the nose section. The young mechanics working in the hangar looked at this contraption and shook their heads in disbelief. They called it, quote, 3. They whispered among themselves that the old man had finally lost his mind. You couldn't simply eyeball aerodynamics principles. You couldn't fix a center of gravity problem using a welding torch and gut instinct. But Gunn kept working steadily. He cut holes in the plexiglass panels for the gun barrels. He ran ammunition chutes through the navigator's compartment, effectively turning the floor into a river of brass casings. He bolted blister packs onto the fuselage skin, adding 2 more guns positioned just below the cockpit window. By the time he finished his modifications, the B-25 strafer looked like some kind of Frankenstein monster. It had guns protruding from virtually every surface. It was nose-heavy, ugly, and strictly unauthorized by any official manual. The official manual for the B-25 Mitchell listed the maximum armament as sufficient for defense. Papy Gun had just bolted on sufficient firepower to cut a building in half. Now he simply had to prove it could fly without shaking itself to pieces. The morning of the first test flight, the airfield in Brisbane was eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that precedes an execution. The flight line mechanics stood back at a distance, arms crossed defensively, watching the strange, nose-heavy beast taxi to the end of the runway. The engineers from North American Aviation had already filed their official reports. They had effectively washed their hands of the entire situation. They claimed the center of gravity was now positioned so far forward that the nose wheel would collapse on impact, or alternatively, the plane would simply refuse to rotate off the ground. They warned that if Major Gunn fired those guns while in midair, the vibration would shake the instrument panel loose, leaving the pilot flying completely blind in a cloud of his own smoke. To them, this wasn't innovation. It was $1 million of government property being driven into a grave by a madman. Papy Gun sat alone in the cockpit. No co-pilot, no crew members. He refused to risk anyone else's life on his theory. He pushed the throttles forward. The twin Cyclone engines roared to life. 3,400 horsepower pulled against the brakes. The plane shook violently. It felt heavy, sluggish, like a truck loaded with cement. He released the brakes. The B-25 lumbered down the tarmac. It didn't want to fly. The nose felt glued to the ground, weighed down by the steel guns, the ammunition, and the heavy iron mounts. The end of the runway rushed toward him rapidly. The engineers watched, expecting the tires to blow out or the plane to run off into the dirt. At the last possible second, Gunn hauled back on the yoke with all his strength. The nose groaned upward reluctantly. The wheels cleared the dirt by mere inches. The strafer was airborne. He climbed to 2,000 feet and headed for the coast. This represented the moment of truth. Flying the heavy beast was one thing. Firing it was something else entirely. Gunn leveled out over the ocean. He armed the system. His thumb hovered over the solenoid switch on the control wheel. He wasn't simply firing guns. He was triggering a controlled explosion inside the airframe. He squeezed the button firmly. The response was immediate and absolutely terrifying. The plane literally slowed down in midair. The combined recoil force of 8.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously effectively acted as a brake, knocking knots off his airspeed. Inside the cockpit, the noise was deafening. A continuous jackhammer roar drowned out even the engines. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of burning gunpowder. The floor became a vibrating plate, but remarkably, the nose stayed attached. The glass didn't shatter. Gunn spider mount, that ugly collection of scrap metal springs and hydraulic shocks, was working perfectly. It was absorbing the violent kick of the guns, allowing the weapons to slide back and forth just fractions of an inch, eating the energy before it could rip the rivets out of the aluminum skin. Gunn watched the tracers arc down into the water below. They didn't spray wildly like water from a loose hose. They converged precisely. At 1,000 yards distance, the streams of lead met in a tight, concentrated cone of destruction. He wasn't spraying an area randomly. He was drilling a hole through space. Gunn landed the plane and taxied back to the hangar. The mechanics who had laughed at his recoil toy walked up to the aircraft cautiously. They saw the soot stains on the nose. They smelled the cordite hanging in the air. But they didn't see any stress fractures anywhere. They didn't see popped rivets. The crazy old man had actually done it. He had built a gunship that defied the manufacturer's physics calculations. But Gunn understood that building the gun was only half the problem. A gun is useless if you don't have a method to deliver the kill shot. The .50 calibers could shred the deck of a ship, kill the crew and start fires, but they couldn't sink a 6,000-ton transport vessel. For that objective, you needed bombs, and dropping bombs from 50 feet was an excellent way to blow yourself out of the sky. This represented the second half of Gunn's impossible equation. He had to teach a generation of pilots trained to fly straight and level at 8,000 feet to fly like complete maniacs. He called it skip bombing. The concept was ancient. It worked exactly like skipping a flat stone across a pond. If you threw the stone at a steep angle, it splashed and sank immediately. If you threw it low and hard, parallel to the water's surface, it skipped. Gunn wanted to do the identical thing with a 500-pound bomb. The physics were simple, but the execution was absolutely terrifying. To make a bomb skip properly, the aircraft had to be flying at 200 miles per hour, perfectly level, at an altitude of no more than 50 feet. If the pilot dropped the bomb too high, it would dive into the water and miss the ship entirely. If he dropped it too low, the splash from the bomb hitting the water could catch the tail of the plane and crash it. And then there was the explosion to consider. A 500-pound bomb has a lethal blast radius that reaches hundreds of feet into the air. If you drop it from 50 feet, the blast will rip the wings off your own plane before you can fly clear. The solution was a timing fuse. Gunn and the armorers set the fuses to a 4 to 5 second delay. The bomb would hit the water, skip across the surface like a stone, slam into the side of the Japanese ship, sink below the waterline, and then detonate. Those 5 seconds gave the pilot exactly enough time to pull up hard, throttle the engines to emergency power, and clear the blast zone. The training was absolutely brutal. Gunn located an old shipwreck, the SS Pruth, sitting on a reef off the coast of Port Moresby. It became the most bombed piece of scrap metal in the entire Pacific theater. The pilots hated it initially. It felt completely unnatural. Every instinct they had learned in flight school screamed at them to pull up. The ocean rushed by so fast it blurred in their peripheral vision. They had to fight the powerful urge to stare at the water. They had to focus entirely on the target ahead. But Gunn was absolutely relentless. He flew with them personally. He sat in the co-pilot seat, shouting over the engine roar, forcing them down lower. Quote, "Tss." This was where the strafer concept finally made complete sense. The pilots realized why they needed those guns. In a standard bombing run, the plane is essentially a sitting duck for the ship's anti-aircraft fire. The ship's gunners have a clear shot at the incoming bomber throughout its approach. But with Gunn's gun modification, the bomber shoots back aggressively. As the pilot begins his attack run 2 miles out, he opens fire with the nose guns. He sprays the deck of the ship systematically. He kills the anti-aircraft crews before they can respond. He smashes the bridge. He forces the captain to take cover. By the time the bomber is close enough to release the bomb, the ship isn't fighting back effectively. It's being suppressed by an overwhelming wall of lead. The B-25 wasn't just a bomber anymore. It had become a suppression weapon that delivered a knockout punch. General Kenny observed the results of the training and immediately ordered every available B-25 to be converted. There wasn't time to send them back to the factory in California. They had to perform the modifications in the jungle. Gunn organized a production line literally in the dirt at Port Moresby. It was a scene of organized chaos. Mechanics worked around the clock, stripping the glass noses off bombers, welding steel plates, cutting holes for barrels, and bolting on the heavy spider mounts. They scavenged parts from wrecked planes scattered around. They stole metal from supply dumps. They worked through tropical rainstorms and malaria outbreaks. They weren't building pretty airplanes. They were building street fighters. By late February 1943, Gunn had assembled a squadron of these hybrid aircraft ready for combat. They were ugly machines. The paint was mismatched. The noses were covered in thick soot, but the pilots had changed fundamentally. They walked differently. They weren't high-altitude bus drivers anymore. They were hunters. They knew they possessed a weapon that the Japanese didn't understand and couldn't effectively counter. They had practiced on the wreck of the Pruth until they could put a bomb through a specific porthole at 200 miles per hour. But shooting at a rusted wreck is fundamentally different from shooting at a destroyer that shoots back. The test came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports began to trickle in from the coast watchers and codebreakers. The Japanese were making their major move. A massive convoy had assembled at Rabaul, the main Japanese fortress in the region. 8 destroyers, 8 large troop transports, thousands of soldiers. They were heading directly for the Huon Gulf. This wasn't a resupply mission. It was an invasion force. If those troops landed successfully at Lae, the Allied foothold in New Guinea would be crushed. The Tokyo Express was coming, and this time it was bringing the entire army. The weather turned bad. A tropical cyclone moved into the Solomon Sea, creating a curtain of rain and low clouds. The Japanese commanders were counting on this weather. They knew the Americans relied heavily on high-altitude bombing. They knew the B-17s couldn't target ships through heavy cloud cover. They believed the storm would cloak their movement, allowing them to slip through the damp silence and land their troops without losing a single man. They were absolutely right about the B-17s. The flying fortresses were grounded or flying blind, unable to see the ocean floor below. The Japanese assumed they were safe, but they didn't know about the modifications happening in the mud at Port Moresby. They didn't know that the Americans had stopped looking down from the stratosphere. They didn't know that a new type of aircraft was sitting on the runway, engines idling, waiting for the signal. These planes didn't need clear skies at 20,000 feet. They actually liked the clouds. They liked the low ceiling. It gave them cover. It allowed them to sneak in at wave-top height, invisible until it was too late. On March 1st, a lone B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the convoy through a break in the storm. The radio message went back to headquarters immediately. 14-ship convoy heading west. The location was plotted. The speed was calculated. They were heading into the Bismarck Sea. The trap was set. General Kenny looked at the map carefully. He looked at the reports from his weather officers. The storm was expected to break in 2 days. He looked at Papy Gun. The time for welding and testing was over. The theory of the recoil spring and the skip bomb was about to be tested against 16 warships and 7,000 men who were ready to die for their emperor. The order went out to the squadrons. Clearing weather predicted maximum effort. Crews were briefed in humid tents. They were shown the silhouettes of the Japanese destroyers, Arashio, Asashio, Yukikase, fast modern warships with 5-inch guns and batteries of 25mm autocannons. The pilots looked at the blurry reconnaissance photos. They looked at their own modified planes with their snub-nosed machine guns and their heavy bomb loads. There was no backup plan. If Gunn's crazy idea failed, the B-25s would be swatted out of the sky like flies, and the Japanese army would pour into New Guinea. On the morning of March 3rd, the clouds began to lift. The Bismarck Sea lay flat and gray. The Japanese convoy moved in a tight defensive formation. The destroyers circled the transports, guns manned, eyes scanning the high-altitude sky, waiting for the B-17. They were looking up. They should have been looking down. At 10 a.m., the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stopped being a battle and started being an execution. The Japanese captains on the destroyers were experienced men. They knew how American air power worked. They expected the high drone of heavy engines at 20,000 feet. They expected to see tiny black dots releasing bombs that would take 40 seconds to fall. They had their helmsmen ready to turn the wheels hard to starboard or port, dodging the ordnance with ease. They were looking at the clouds, waiting for the B-17s. They were playing a game of chess against a grandmaster who was moving very slowly. They didn't realize that Papy Gun had flipped the chessboard over and pulled out a knife. The first sign that something was terribly wrong wasn't a sound. It was a shape. Out of the mist on the horizon, a swarm of aircraft appeared, but they weren't the high-altitude specks the Japanese were trained to spot. These planes were hugging the deck, flying so low their propellers were kicking up spray from the ocean surface. Leading the charge were Australian bow fighters, heavy twin-engine fighters with 4 cannons in the nose. They came in first, acting as the suppression team, raking the decks of the destroyers to force the gun crews to keep their heads down. Then came the B-25s, the strafers, the 91st Squadron, the 38th Group. They came in line abreast, a wall of aluminum moving at 200 miles per hour. Inside the lead bomber, the pilot lined up on the destroyer Arashio. The Japanese ship was a 2,000-ton beast, bristling with weaponry. In a normal engagement, the destroyer wins this fight every time. Its 5-inch main guns can vaporize a bomber 3 miles out. Its 25-millimeter autocannons can shred an airframe at 1 mile distance. But the Horatio couldn't fire its main guns at a target flying 10 feet off the water. The barrels couldn't depress low enough, and the autocannon crews were staring down the barrels of something they had never encountered before. The B-25 pilot flipped the solenoid switch. This was the moment the North American aviation engineers had warned about. This was the moment the nose was supposed to snap off. The pilot squeezed the trigger. The recoil spring system, that ugly, jury-rigged contraption of junkyard springs and shock absorbers, slammed backward. The entire airframe groaned under the stress. The cockpit vibrated so violently the instruments blurred. But the rivets held, the glass held, and from the nose of the plane a solid stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds erupted. 8.50 caliber machine guns firing at once creates a density of fire that is hard to comprehend. It's not just bullets. It's a physical force. The rounds didn't just hit the Horatio. They disassembled it. They punched through the steel plating of the bridge. They shredded the thin metal of the gun tubs. They turned the deck into a slaughterhouse. The Japanese gunners didn't have time to aim properly. They were cut down where they stood. The recoil system worked so perfectly that the pilots could hold the trigger down for 3, 4, 5 seconds continuously. They could walk the fire from the bow of the ship to the stern, hosing it down like they were cleaning a driveway, but the machine guns were just the can opener. The bomb was the knife. The pilot held the dive until the destroyer filled the entire windscreen. At 300 yards, he was staring directly into the eyes of the terrified men on the bridge. He released the bomb. A 500-pound cylinder of high explosive dropped from the bay. It didn't fall. It flew. It hit the water at a shallow angle, skipping off the surface like a flat stone thrown by a giant. It bounced once, twice, 3 times. It slammed into the side of the Horatio right at the waterline. The delay fuse ticked. 1 second, 2 seconds. The B-25 roared directly over the ship's mast. The pilot pulled back on the stick hard. The engines screamed. 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The bomb detonated. The explosion didn't go up. It went in. It blew a hole the size of a garage door in the side of the destroyer. The shock wave lifted the 2,000-ton ship out of the water. The boiler rooms flooded instantly. The Horatio broke its back. This scene was repeating itself across the entire convoy. The Japanese formation shattered completely. The troop transports, fat, slow ships carrying thousands of soldiers, were defenseless. They had relied on the destroyers for protection, but the destroyers were burning. Papy Gun's pilots turned toward the transports like wolves descending on a flock of sheep. They lined up for their runs. They didn't even need the bombs for the softer targets. The .50 calibers were sufficient. The heavy rounds tore through the unarmored hulls of the transport ships. They ignited the fuel drums stored on the decks. They detonated the ammunition crates stacked in the holds. One B-25 pilot, Major Ed Larner, took his plane so low that he had to pull up sharply to avoid hitting the mast of a transport. As he flew over, his tail gunner strafed the deck from the rear. The ship was the Kyokusei Maru. It was carrying aviation fuel. When the skip bombs hit it, the ship didn't just sink. It vaporized. A fireball rose 1,000 feet into the air. The B-25 flying behind Larner had to fly directly through the fireball. The paint on its wings blistered from the intense heat. The pilot came out the other side, soot-stained and shaking, but still flying. The commerce destroyer concept was working with terrifying efficiency. The skip bombing technique was proving to be lethally accurate. At high altitude, a 10% hit rate was considered excellent. At mast height, the B-25s were achieving a hit rate of nearly 50%. They weren't missing. They were putting bombs into the engine rooms of moving ships with precision. The Japanese captains tried to maneuver, tried to zigzag, but you can't outrun an airplane flying at 200 knots. The B-25s would simply circle, wait for the ship to commit to a turn, and then strike from the broadside. By noon, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. The destroyer Yukikaze was dead in the water, sinking. The Asashio was burning from stem to stern. All 8 transports were hit. Most were sinking or already gone. The water was covered in a thick layer of oil, debris, and thousands of struggling survivors. The B-25s ran out of bombs, but they didn't go home. They came back for strafing runs. They used the recoil spring guns to finish off the crippled ships. They punched holes in the lifeboats. They strafed the debris fields. It was brutal industrial killing. It was war without mercy. But the pilots remembered the reports from Bataan. They remembered the stories of American prisoners being executed. They remembered Papy Gun's family in Manila. They kept shooting until the barrels of their guns glowed red hot and the ammunition chutes were empty. Back at the base, the ground crews waited anxiously. They heard the drone of engines returning. They counted the planes. They were all coming back. Some had holes in the wings. Some had pieces of Japanese ship rigging stuck in their landing gear. One B-25 landed with a crushed nose wheel, not from a bad landing, but because it had clipped the smokestack of a sinking transport. The pilots climbed out of the cockpits. They were soaked in sweat, their hands shaking from the adrenaline and the vibration. They walked into the debriefing hut and threw their flight helmets on the table. General Kenny looked at the reports. He couldn't believe the numbers. In one single morning, Papy Gun's suicide boxes had inflicted more damage to the Japanese Navy than the entire 5th Air Force had accomplished in the previous 6 months. The high-altitude B-17s, which had also participated in the raid, claimed a few hits, but the reconnaissance photos told the real story. The ships had holes in their sides right at the waterline. That was the signature of the skip bomb. The decks were chewed up, the bridges destroyed. That was the signature of the strafer nose. The impossible physics of the recoil system had held up perfectly. The springs had absorbed the energy of hundreds of thousands of rounds. The mounts hadn't cracked. The glass hadn't shattered. The engineers who had mocked the idea, who had written the memos about center of gravity and stress fractures, were silent. The math had said it couldn't be done. The wreckage burning in the Bismarck Sea said otherwise. That evening, the Tokyo Express ceased to exist. The Japanese High Command in Rabaul was in shock. They had lost an entire division of troops. They had lost vital destroyers. They had lost the ability to reinforce New Guinea by sea. They sent a message to Tokyo. Quote, Tot 10. They didn't know it was the work of a 43-year-old major with a welder and a grudge. They just knew that the Bismarck Sea was now closed to shipping. The victory was absolute. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, over 3,000 Japanese troops killed. The Americans lost 13 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of naval warfare, and it was won by a plane that wasn't supposed to exist, using a tactic that the manual said was suicide. fired through a mounting system made of scrap metal. Papy Gun walked out to the flight line that night. He touched the nose of his B-25. The metal was cool now. The soot was thick on the aluminum. He checked the springs on the mount. They were compressed, worn, but unbroken. He lit a cigarette and looked north toward the Philippines. He had killed a lot of men that day. He had sunk a lot of ships, but he knew it wasn't enough. His family was still in Santo Tomas. The war wasn't over. He would have to build more planes. He would have to find more guns. He would have to kill more destroyers. And God help anyone who told him it was impossible. The silence that followed the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was louder than the gunfire had been. In the officers' clubs in Brisbane and the boardrooms of North American Aviation in California, the laughter stopped completely. The recoil spring wasn't a joke anymore. It was the new doctrine. The engineers, who had written lengthy memos explaining why the B-25 would disintegrate if you put machine guns in the nose now, had to explain why a mechanic working in the jungle had outsmarted their entire design department. They didn't send an apology letter. They sent a team of draftsmen carrying measuring tape. They arrived at Gunn's open-air workshop in Port Moresby, sweating in their clean uniforms, holding clipboards. They climbed over the soot-stained, battle-scarred B-25s. They measured the thickness of the steel plates. They sketched the ugly welded spider mounts. They poked at the scavenged shock absorbers. They realized that while the math said this shouldn't fly, the physics of combat said it was the most lethal medium bomber in the world. The factory representatives did exactly what smart men do when they've been beaten. They stole the idea completely. They packed up their drawings, flew back to the United States, and started building the B-25J. When the new J models rolled off the assembly line in Kansas City, they didn't have a glass nose for a bombardier. They had a solid metal nose packed with 8.50 caliber machine guns installed at the factory using a refined version of Papy Gun's suspension system. They called it the Bajas Coyote 11. The manual was rewritten. The suicide box became the standard configuration for the rest of the war. Gunn didn't get a patent. He didn't get a royalty check. He just got the satisfaction of watching thousands of factory-built clones of his impossible plane arrive in the Pacific to finish the job he started. But Gunn wasn't finished himself. The victory at the Bismarck Sea didn't satisfy him. It just proved that his method worked. His family was still in Santo Tomas. The Japanese were still in the Philippines, so Gunn kept escalating. If .50 caliber machine guns were good, he decided a cannon would be better. He took a 75 millimeter field artillery piece, a weapon designed to be towed by a truck and fired from the ground, and decided to shove it into the nose of a B-25. The recoil of a 75 millimeter cannon is like getting hit by a freight train. When he test-fired it, the plane almost stopped in midair. The rivets popped. The structure groaned, but he made it work. He created a flying tank destroyer that could sink a ship with a single shell from 2 miles away. He flew these Frankenstein aircraft until his body started to fail him. In late 1944, during a mission over the Philippines, Gunn's luck finally ran thin. He was shot down. His plane crashed into the jungle. He survived, but he was badly burned by white phosphorus. He lost a finger. His arm was mangled. The flight surgeons took one look at him and signed the papers to ground him permanently. They told him his war was over. He was a 45-year-old man with a crippled hand and third-degree burns. He should have been on a hospital ship heading to San Francisco. Gunn ignored the doctors the same way he had ignored the engineers. He wasn't leaving until he opened the gates of Santo Tomas. He talked his way back onto flight status. He flew supplies. He flew reconnaissance. He flew anything with wings. When General MacArthur finally returned to the Philippines, landing ashore at Leyte, Papy Gun was flying overhead. He was watching the ground, counting the miles to Manila. On February 3rd, 1945, the nightmares ended. The 1st Cavalry Division smashed through the gates of the Santo Tomas internment camp. They found 3,700 civilians who were barely alive. They were skeletons, starving, surviving on less than 700 calories a day. Among the walking ghosts were Paul Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years of hell. They had survived the hunger, the disease, and the brutality of the guards. When Papy Gun finally walked into that camp, he wasn't the legendary commerce destroyer. He was just a husband and a father who had spent every waking second of the last 3 years trying to build a machine violent enough to save them. He found them alive. That was the only victory that mattered. The ships at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, the medals on his chest, the history books. None of it meant anything compared to the moment he put his arms around his wife. The rage that had fueled him, the cold anger that had allowed him to turn a bomber into a slaughterhouse, finally evaporated. After the war, the Air Force tried to keep him. They offered him promotions, a desk at the Pentagon, a chance to teach the next generation of engineers. Gunn turned them down. He had no interest in peacetime bureaucracy. He had no interest in wearing a uniform when there was no one left to fight. He stayed in the Philippines. He loved the islands. He started a civilian airline, Philippine Airlines. He went back to doing what he did before the world caught fire, flying people and cargo over the jungle, fixing engines with baling wire, and landing on dirt strips that terrified younger pilots. But men like Papy Gun don't die in bed. They don't fade away in a retirement home playing shuffleboard. They live by the machine, and eventually the machine claims them. On January 16th, 1957, Gunn was flying a Beechcraft Bonanza through a storm near Manila. He was 57 years old. He had survived the Japanese Navy, the jungle, plane crashes, and phosphorus burns. He had survived the skeptics and the generals, but he couldn't survive the weather. The plane went down. Papy Gun died instantly. His legacy isn't sitting in a museum case. It's flying over the battlefield today. Every time you see an A-10 Warthog, a plane that is essentially a giant gun with wings wrapped around it, you're looking at the great-grandchild of Papy Gun's B-25. Every time you see an AC-130 gunship circling a target, pouring fire from the side, you are seeing the evolution of the strafer concept. Gunn proved that in war, the person who adapts the fastest wins. He proved that the manual is just a suggestion, and that an engineer with a welding torch and a reason to fight is more dangerous than a committee of experts. Most historians focus on the admirals and the generals. They talk about Nimitz and MacArthur. They talk about grand strategy and fleet movements. But the war in the Pacific wasn't won by arrows on a map. It was won by guys like Papy Gun, men who looked at a problem, realized the official solution was going to get them killed, and built their own solution out of scrap metal. He took a defensive bomber and turned it into an offensive weapon that broke the back of the Japanese merchant marine. He did it while everyone told him he was crazy. He did it while they laughed at his recoil spring. And he did it for the simplest reason of all. He just wanted to get his kids back. If this story moved you, if you believe that innovation often comes from the guys with dirty hands rather than the guys in the suits, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter. It helps us find more forgotten legends like Papy Gun. And make sure you're subscribed to WW2 Combat Sky. We are digging through the archives every day looking for the men and women who changed history with nothing but grit and a refusal to quit. Drop a comment below and tell us, what is the craziest field modification you've ever heard of? Have you ever had to fix something when the expert said it was broken forever? We want to hear your stories. We read every single comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. We rescue these stories to ensure Paul, quote, 12. Gun doesn't disappear into silence.